Hi folks, and welcome to this video on issuing a bond that's convertible where conversion is at the investor's option. So in this example, we have a company, AMC Limited. They issued 5-year, 5% bonds, and they're issuing them for they're the same as their par value, which is $900,000 on the 1st of January X1. Bond pays interest annually, and they're convertible into common shares at a rate of 50 shares for every $1,000 bond. So here you can see that we're using a fixed conversion factor. So we have a stated conversion price. So we know that those bonds are convertible into a fixed number of shares. And in this case, 50 common for every $1,000 bond. Now, in the required, we want you to assume that the bonds were convertible, again at the investor's option, and the option to convert had a value. So the equity piece is valued at $73,800. Provide the journal entry at the issue date, calculate interest expense, calculate the journal entry to record maturity of the bond, assuming that they were converted into shares, and then we have a early redemption or an early retirement of the bonds, and we'll get to that in a moment. But first, if we look at the data that we had here, we're going to use this data in order to make our journal entry at the issue date. So you can see here, we're going to record the cash paid here, and they did tell us that we got the par value for the bonds at $900,000. Now, we're also going to record our bond payable at $900,000, but we know as part of that $900,000 in cash, part of it was for the conversion option, or the rights to convert, so $73,800. So we know we have a discount bond, so the bond must be valued at its carrying value of $826,200, which is the difference between the face value and the discount. Why? Because if we paid $900,000 to get a bond, and that included the conversion price, we must have a discount bond, right? So in order to balance the entry, we're going to debit the discount for $73,800. To calculate the interest expense each period, what are we going to do? We're going to take the carrying value of the bond to open each period and multiply it by 7% to calculate interest expense. So this number here, this $57,834, just to give an idea of what this is, this would be equal to 826,200 times 0.07, right? So you can calculate the interest expense every period using the carrying value to open the period for which you're calculating interest expense and multiplying it by your yield or market rate, which is 7%. They give us that in the question right here. All right. The payment is always going to be $45,000. Okay. So, and we know that because the bonds are 5% bonds. So 900,000 times 5. So we know our PMT, I'll just do this here, our payment is going to be equal to 900,000, which is the face value of the bonds, times our coupon, which is 5%. And don't forget, we don't need to multiply it by a fraction because the bond is paying interest. Everything is done annually, right? Bond pays interest annually. So we don't have to worry about semi-annual or quarterly or anything like that. So the amortized discount is the difference between the payment and the expense. So we have unamortized now, the difference between what we started with, which is $73,800 unamortized, and what we amortized of it, which is $60,966. So the carrying value of our bond is the carrying value to open the period plus what we amortized, which is going to give us $839,034. So you can work this all the way through yourself. I think you're familiar with the method, and you'll come to the fact that the carrying value of the bond at maturity, which is at the end of 5 years, is $900,000. The only thing you'll notice I did here is I rounded this. You would probably, if you did this math here, took the carrying value of $883,182 and multiplied it by 7%, you'd probably get $61,822. So we'd be $4 different, right? And that's okay. It's $4. I just rounded it so that when I got here, I'd have an unamortized discount of 0. All right. Now, in the third requirement, they said to provide the journal entry at maturity, assuming that the bonds were converted. So if we converted the bonds, what do we need to do? Well, first thing we need to do, just put this in here, is we would get rid of the bond by debiting it, okay? We'd get rid of the contributed capital on the share rights because we're already converting. So when we use up the rights, we got to get rid of them, right? So using the book value method, we'd credit common shares for $973,800. Now, for the last part of the question, it says here that assume instead, so instead of assuming in part 3 that we waited till maturity to convert, let's assume here that the issuer of the bonds, in this case AMC, they decided to buy the bonds back from us for $940,000, which is the market price after the interest was paid in year 3. So they're buying them back from us. AMC is buying back the bonds that include the conversion privilege or the conversion option at the end of year 3 after the interest is paid. So now what we need to do is we need to provide the journal entry to retire the bond. We're retiring it before maturity, assuming that $68,000 of this $940,000 related to the option, and the balance of this $940,000 is going to be related to the bond itself. So in this case, we need to divide this up into a few steps. Let's remove the bond and any unamortized discount. Well, that's one of the reasons we did the table, because we can see that at the end of year 3, there's a discount of $32,540 that we're not going to be amortizing. Why? Because the bond is being taken off the books because the company is buying it back from us, so they're no longer going to have the bond. So we're going to remove the bond at its face value, because don't forget we set the bond up at its face value, $900,000 at the issue date. So we're going to remove the bond, debit it for $900,000, and remove the unamortized discount for $32,540. We're also going to remove the conversion rights. Well, don't forget, we never had a chance to convert it. The company bought it back. So we're going to get rid of the contributed capital on the conversion rights. And don't forget, we set this up at the issue date, right? So because we didn't use the conversion rights, the company bought it back, we're going to get rid of that. And that's sitting on our books at $73,800. Now, don't forget, that was part of the $900,000 that the company paid when we issued the bond to the investor, right? So in other words, this $900,000 included payment for these conversion rights, right? So now, don't forget, the conversion rights now in the marketplace are only worth $68,000. How do we know that? Because we were told that in the question that the $940,000 repurchase price included $68,000, which is what the going rate was for the options or the conversion rights at the date that the company, that AMC, retired the bonds. So we paid, in other words, we the investor paid AMC and $5,800, right? More. Because if the options are now worth, the options to convert are worth $68,000 and we paid $73,800, that's $5,800 worth of value that AMC is not giving back to the investors. They're going to keep it. So when we remove the rights at the price we paid for them, we have to acknowledge that $5,800 of that is money that the investor is not getting back. We're keeping it. So we compare what the rights are worth now to what they are actually sitting on our books at, which is $73,800. So that's $5,800 worth of value that we, the issuer, AMC, are keeping. So in essence, that's $5,800, which is part of the $73,800 that investors paid us for the conversion option. It's part of that $900,000 here, right? That they're not getting back. So we credit contributed capital on the retirement of the conversion options for $5,800. Now, the third thing we need to do is to credit cash paid. Well, we know it's $940 from the question. So we can see we're a little bit light on the debit side, so that means we're going to incur a loss on the retirement for the difference, which is to balance the entry, which is $4,540. Now, sometimes students would like to calculate it. There is a way to calculate it. You can also say, well, I know that the bonds are worth $872,000, because remember here they said that of the $940,000 they were going to pay their investors to buy it back. $68,000 of that was the value of the options. So we could say the value of the bond at market price is $940,000 less $68,000, and that's going to be $872,000, right? We could say that. So in that case, what would we do? Well, if your bond in the marketplace is worth $872,000, and that's the value they gave you when they bought it back from you, they being AMC, and the bond is sitting on your books now at $867,460, then you've got a liability sitting on your books of $867,460, right? So the difference between that and the actual market value of the bond, the actual value of the bond liability at $872, that difference is $45.40. So you can also calculate the loss on bond retirement that way. So now, just to understand why this is a loss, here's something we can think about. It's costing us $872,000 to retire a bond. We've got the liability booked at $867,460. That's right in our table right here at the end of year 3, right? So the idea is, if it's costing us as AMC $872,000 to retire the bond, and the bond is only booked at $867,460, then we've got a loss of the difference, which is $45.40. So this concludes an additional example of convertible bonds whereby the conversion is at the investor's option. I hope you found it helpful.